Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Patriot's History of the United States. And as always, I am continuing to read through a Patriot's History of the United States from beginning to end. And we are in the American Revolution. And we just got through Washington's victories at Trenton and Princeton. And now we are up to common sense and the Declaration of Independence. Now, as always, I'm reading from the 15th anniversary edition. If you have an earlier edition or even a different printing, sometimes the header may be a little different or the pages may be off. Usually the headers will be the same, though. It's only in the editions where we really change the headers too much. So if you can't find the exact page number, and I will be starting on page 86, you can check for Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence. And as I may have mentioned before, I am working on an update that will bring Patriot's history up to 2023. Should have that done later this summer sometime, and I will make that free in a PDF form on the Wild World of History website. So just stay tuned as to when to get the update. But the update will correlate with the 15th anniversary edition. So I'll say on such and such a page, insert this, and it's going to be on this edition. All right. Let's get started. As Washington's ragtag army tied up British forces, feelings for independence grew more intense. The movement awaited only a spokesman who could galvanize public opinion around resistance against the king. How unlikely, then, was the figure that emerged? Thomas Paine had come to America just over a year before he wrote Common Sense, arriving as a failure in almost everything he attempted in his life. He wrecked his first marriage, and his second wife paid him to leave. Some people have that experience. He destroyed two businesses, one as a tobacconist and one as a corset maker, and flopped as a tax collector. But Paine had fire in his blood and defiance in his spirit. In January 1776, he wrote his 50-page political tract, Common Sense, but his The American Crisis, published 11 months later during the darkest time of the American Revolution, began with some of the most memorable lines in history. So this is from The American Crisis, not Common Sense, which I'm going to read from in a minute. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. Eager readers did not shrink from the book, which quickly sold more than 100,000 copies. Paine sold close to 500,000 copies prior to 1800, which was the equivalent of selling 12 million copies today, meaning that 1 in 6 American homes had seen Common Sense. He could have been a wealthy man if he hadn't donated every cent he earned to the revolution. Common Sense provided the prelude to Jefferson's Declaration of Independence that appeared in July 1776. Paine argued that the time for loyalty to the king had ended, quote, "The blood of the slain, the sweeping voice of nature cries, 'tis time to part." So let's take a minute here. And I'm going to be reading from the Patriot's History Reader, where we have Common Sense by Thomas Paine. And I'll read you the introduction first. Written by Thomas Paine and published in January 1776, this pamphlet was the most incendiary and effective document in mobilizing American patriots against King George III and Great Britain. A rather long tract, only brief excerpts are presented here, but the ringing tone and effective use of arousing and pejorative terms such as tyranny to describe the British monarchy eliminated the argument that King George was a benign ruler who was being misled. Paine took no prisoners. and his rhetoric appealed to raw emotions to arouse the populace. One of the few deists among the founders, perhaps actually the only one, I don't know, maybe Jefferson. Paine was an Englishman who had only recently arrived in the colonies. Following the American Revolution, Paine returned to Europe, was imprisoned in England, went to France to support the French Revolution, and very narrowly escaped the guillotine. The story is that every evening, the jailers would go through and put a white X on the door of anyone who was to be taken off to the guillotine the following day. And that Paine was marked with an X, but he had a severe cough or illness. It was clear he was sick, and the jailer took pity on him and left the door open so he could get fresh air. And the next morning, when the murder squad came through, they didn't see an X on his door because it was turned toward the wall, and they let him live by accident. It's worth noting that Paine clearly states that government must be relatively local to be effective, and that the rule of law coming from God, isn't this interesting? He's, if anything, only a deist, maybe an atheist, but he says that the rule of law comes from God and made by the people takes precedence over all. These were odd and telling assessments coming from a deist and reinforce the premise that a common law tradition is necessary to the establishment and long-term survival of a representative democracy. So here's some excerpts from Common Sense on page 16 of the Patriot's History Reader. Volumes have been written on the subject of the struggle between England and America. Men of all ranks have embarked on the controversy from different motives with different designs, and all have been intellectual, and the period of debate is over. Arms, as the last resort, must decide the contest. The appeal was the choice of the king, and the continent has accepted the challenge. The sun never shone on a cause of greater worth. 'Tis not the affair of a city, a country, a county, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent, of at least 1/8 part of the habitable globe. So Paine is saying basically that all of North America is united against the king, which of course was not true. As we saw last time, Canada absolutely was not against King George. Quote, "'Tis not the concern of a day, a year, or an age. Posterity are virtually involved in the contest and will be more or less affected even to the end of time by the proceedings now." Isn't that interesting? He says, from here on out, history will mark this moment. And so far, that hasn't changed. We're still here. I know a lot of people think we're going down the toilet, but we're still here. Now is the seed time of continual union, faith, and honor. I have heard it asserted by some that as America has flourished under her former connection with Great Britain, the same connection is necessary toward her future happiness and will always have the same effect. Nothing can be more fallacious than this kind of argument. In other words, things will just keep going. They'll be fine, and we're good under King George. And he says, no, that's wrong. We may as well assert that because a child has thrived upon milk that it is never to have meat, or that the first 20 years of our lives is to become the precedent for the next 20. But she had protected us, some say, meaning England, and she has engrossed us in true and defended the continent at our expense, as well as her own admitted, and she would have defended Turkey from the same motives, viz. For the sake of trade and dominion. We have boasted the protection of Great Britain without considering that her motive was interest, not attachment, and that she did not protect us from our enemies on our account, but from her enemies on her own account. In other words, there was nothing about us that England was protecting. It was all about protecting England's interests. France and Spain never were, nor perhaps ever will be, our enemies as Americans, but as our being the subjects of Great Britain. So now Paine is laying down the argument that we have no beef with Spain and France. England does, but we Americans don't. We don't have any reason to fight them. But Britain is the parent country, say some. Then the more shame upon her conduct. Even brutes do not devour their young, nor savages make war upon their families. Wherefore the assertion, if true, turns to her approach. But it happens not to be true, or only partly so, and the phrase parent or mother country has been Jesuitically adopted by the king and his parasites with a low papistical design of gaining an unfair bias on the credulous weakness of our minds. Wow, what a sentence. He's saying, first of all, they use Jesuitical logic. Okay, the Jesuits were the academic, scholarly shock troops, as they're often called, of the Catholic Church. And they were especially noted for their rigorous logic and academic training. I taught at a Jesuit school, Brophy College Prep here in Phoenix, for between 2 and 4 years. I was there part-time, then I was there full-time. And so when you're saying somebody is Jesuitical, you are saying that they are academic and logical in their approach, kind of bloodless, not emotional, but very cold. And so he's saying that the king and his parasites had a low design of gaining an unfair bias on the weakness of our mind. He's saying essentially, oh, we Americans are kind of slow. We aren't picking up what the king is doing. Not sure I'd agree with that. Certainly don't think Jefferson and Franklin were slow. Payne continues. Europe and not England is the parent country of America. This new world had been the asylum for the persecuted lovers of civil and religious liberty from every part of Europe. Hither they have fled, not from the tender embraces of the mother, but from the cruelty of the monster. And it is so far true of England that the same tyranny which drove the first immigrants from home pursues her descendants still. In other words, this isn't a mother lovingly embracing her babies. This is a monster chasing out people, the monster of tyranny, chasing out people from all over Europe, and they all end up here. As Bill Murray said in the movie Stripes, you know, we're mongrels. We were chased out of every decent country in Europe. There's some truth to that, but also a lot of people were very bright and saw that they had no future in these decent countries. Payne continues. Not 1/3 of the inhabitants, even of this province, America, are of English descent. And he's referring to Scots and Irish and Swedes and Scots-Irish and Germans and all sorts of other people. Wherefore, I reprobate the phrase of parent or mother country applied to England only as being false, selfish, narrow, and ungenerous. Europe is too quickly planted with kingdoms to be long at peace. And wherever a war breaks out between England and any foreign country, the trade of America goes to ruin because of her connection to Britain. Like, we get drawn into these wars and we pay for it with our economy. Everything that is right or natural pleads for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, 'tis time to part. Even the distance at which the Almighty has placed England and America is a strong and natural proof that the authority of one over the other was never the design of heaven. He's saying, hey, if God wanted us to be together, we'd be closer together geographically. How about that argument? The time, likewise, at which the continent was discovered adds weight to the argument, and the manner in which it was peopled increases the force of it. The Reformation was preceded by the discovery of America, as if the Almighty graciously meant to open a sanctuary to the persecuted in future years, when home should afford neither friendship nor safety. And this is a pretty astounding argument for a deist. God created the American continent because he knew the Reformation was taking place, and he knew good Christians everywhere would be chased out of Europe by the evil papists and by the Anglicans, and they would need someplace to go. That's what he's saying. Though I would carefully avoid giving unnecessary offense, I don't want to offend the Catholics. Yet I am inclined to believe that all those who espouse the doctrine of reconciliation may be included within the following descriptions: interested men who are not to be trusted. I'm not dissing anybody. I'm not calling anybody names, but hey, if you're standing up for the king, you're not to be trusted. You have an interest. Weak men who cannot see, prejudiced men who will not see, and a certain set of moderate men who think better of European world than it deserves. So we've got weak guys who don't want to see, and we've even got moderate people who think better of the Europeans than really they ought to think of them. That's quite an assessment. And this last class, that is the moderate men, by an ill-judged deliberation will be the cause of more calamities to the continent than all the other three. This is interesting. Tom Paine is saying something that's going to shock you, that Lenin and every revolutionary since the American Revolution figured out the problem in a revolution is the moderates. The people just want to go along, get along, want to reach across the aisle. Those people, they're the problem. And therefore, he wanted to push people one way or the other. Make a choice. Decide. Are you with the king or are you with the revolution? Now, Lenin was much more brutal about it. He said, and I quote, we'll ask a man, are you for the revolution or against it? If he says against it, we'll stand him up against a wall, in brackets, and shoot him. Right? So our political system, since we became a country, works for moderation. Everything about the system is designed to push people into finding agreements and compromises. And often, maybe most of the time, that's what needs to happen. But there are times when you need to tell people, make a choice. Because if we continue down this road, we're going to die. Lincoln said that. What did he say? Young people. He said, a house divided against itself, what? Cannot stand. He didn't say it would be destroyed, and he didn't say it would go away. Lincoln said what? It would become either one or the other, either all free or all slave. But you couldn't have a half and half society. A little editorializing here. The same thing is happening to us with these various sexual liberation movements. You won't be able to just be a moderate, just go along to get along. You're going to be pushed, and they will push you into making a stand and making a choice. So this comes from Tom Paine. He was calling this out 200 years ago. And so he says, again, that the moderates are the problem, that sooner or later you're going to have to eliminate the moderates, not kill them, but force them one way or another through economic circumstances or through retribution, doing acts that force retribution in such a way so that they make a choice. The way terrorists have done this over the years, say Algeria with France, is that they kill the moderates, or they engage in such acts of terror that the French government, which was trying to moderate, obviously they're the colonial oppressors, they've got Algeria, but what the revolutionaries were trying to do was to engage in such acts of terror that the French had to crack down harder and harder and harder, and eventually in Algeria they reinstituted torture because they were pushed to do it, right? Well, think about 9/11. What do we do after 9/11? We got to have the Patriot Act. And so we rushed to install all of these infringements on our freedoms, really out of fear, out of concern. Well, that's the goal of terrorists. And that's what Paine is pointing out here, that we're going to have to push people Reconciliation, he says, is now a fallacious dream. Nature has deserted the connection, and art cannot supply her place. In other words, you're not going to be able to paper this over with cultural norms and make the two sides get together over cultural matters, because it's going to take over culture as we see today. 4, as Milton, that'd be John Milton, wisely expresses, quote, never can true reconciliation grow where wounds of deadly hate have pierced so deep. I'm on YouTube, so I can't comment too much more on this. There's something very absurd, Paine says, in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. In no instance has nature made the satellite larger than its primary planet. That's kind of interesting. And as England and America, with respect to each other, reverses the common order of nature, it is evident they belong to different systems, England to Europe, America to itself. It's interesting that he sees England as a part of Europe, right? Because what the English just do, Brexit. They just say, oh, we're not so European after all. And the English really are kind of betwixt and between. They're an island who don't really belong to Europe, but they certainly don't belong to America. And they had, up until 70 years ago, this empire that included these huge nations like India that they were governing under dominion status. The powers of governing still remaining in the hands of the king, he will have a negative over the whole legislation of this continent. And as he has shown himself to be such an inveterate enemy to liberty and discovered such a thirst for arbitrary power, is he or is he not a proper person to say these colonies, quote, you shall make no laws but what I please? And is there any inhabitant of America so ignorant as not to know that according to what is called present constitution, this continent can make no laws but what the king gives leave to? He's saying, do you guys not get it? That we can't make a law because he has to give his approval. And is there any man so unwise not to see that, considering what has happened, he will suffer no law to be made here but what suits his own purposes? We may as effectually be enslaved by the want of laws in America as by submitting to laws made for us in England. We are already greater than the king wishes us to be. Will he not heretofore endeavor to make us less? To bring the matter to one point, is the power who is jealous of our prosperity a proper power to govern us? Whoever says no to this question is an independent, for independency means no more than whether we shall make our own laws. Remember, we discussed this whole concept of what makes a free man, or whether the king, the greatest enemy which this continent has or can have, shall tell us, quote, there shall be no laws but such as I like. America is only a secondary object in the system of British politics. England consults the good of this country no further than it answers for her own purpose. Wherefore, her own interest leads her to suppress the growth of ours in every case, which does not promote her advantage or in the least interferes with it. So England's going to hold us down as we try to get stronger and more prosperous. The most powerful of all arguments is that nothing but independence, i.e. a continental form of government, can keep the peace of the continent and preserve it inviolate from civil wars. I dread the event of a reconciliation with Britain now, as it's more than probable that it will be followed by a revolt somewhere or other, the consequences of which may be far more fatal than all the malice of Britain. He says that if we keep going this way, we're going to have a bunch of civil wars. It's not going to stop. Sooner or later, we're going to have a big one. Thousands are already ruined by British barbarity. Thousands more will probably suffer the same fate. Those men have other feelings than us who have nothing suffered. All they now possess is liberty. What they before enjoyed is sacrifice to the service, and having nothing more to lose, they disdain submission. So he says that right now there's people out there who haven't been hurt economically, but they will be. But right now, all they have to lose is their liberty. And where, say some, is the king of America? I'll tell you, friend, he reigns above. This is amazing. This guy's supposed to be a deist. This is like the fourth time he says God's ruling over everything. We only have one king, and that's God. This is amazing. He reigns above and does not make havoc of mankind like the royal brute of Britain. Yet that we may not appear to be defective even in earthly honors, let a day be solemnly set apart for proclaiming the charter. Let it be brought forth, placed on the divine law, the word of God. Let a crown be placed thereon, by which the world may know that as far as we approve of monarchy, that in America the law is king. But what's the law based on? God. And so, well, he's just saying that to rile people up. These kinds of words don't flow unless you believe it. Congressman J.C. Watts of Oklahoma, former quarterback of the Oklahoma University Sooners, used to have a saying. He said, what's down in the well comes up in the bucket, meaning what comes out of your mouth is going to be what's in your heart. So when you hear people go nuts and whatnot, that's what's in their heart. So he's saying the law is king and the law is based on God. For as in absolute governments, the king is law, so in free countries, the law ought to be king. And there ought to be no other, but lest any ill use should be afterwards arise, let the crown at the conclusion of the ceremony be demolished and scattered among the people whose right it is. So he says, let's have a little ceremony and let's crown, as it were, the law king. And then after the ceremony, smash the crown to pieces, sort of like the dragon did in Game of Thrones, where at the end he breathes fire on the Iron Throne and melts it entirely, so nobody again will ever sit on the Iron Throne. A government of our own is our natural right. Whoa, remember that? Remember we talked about Locke. Locke, natural right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. He says, Paine says, government of our own is our natural right. So we have the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and government of our own. And when a man seriously reflects on the precariousness of human affairs, he will become convinced that it is infinitely wiser and safer to form a constitution out of our own in a cool, deliberate manner while we have it in our power than to trust such an interesting event to time and place. In other words, we better do this while we can. Ye that tell us of harmony and reconciliation, can ye restore to us the time that is past? Great point. Paine is saying, okay, you people who want reconciliation with the king, can you restore all the stuff that he's done to us? Can ye give us prostitution, its former innocence? Neither can ye reconcile Britain and America. The last cord now is broken. The people of England are presenting addresses against us. These are injuries which nature cannot forgive. She would cease to be nature if she did. These are things you can't forgive. They're just against God. As well can the lower forgive the ravisher of his mistress as the continent forgive the murders of Britain. The Almighty has implanted in us an inextinguishable feelings for good and wise purposes. They are the guardians of his image in our hearts. There it is again. God has planted in our hearts the law. What did I tell you about common law? Common law comes from the notion that God plants the law in the hearts of the people, and they elect or select leaders to enforce or carry out that law. They are the guardians of his image in our hearts and distinguish us from the herd of common animals. The social compact would dissolve and justice be extirpated from the earth, or have only a casual existence were we callous to the touches of our affection. The robber and the murderer would often escape unpunished, as did the injuries which our tempers sustain provoke us to justice. O ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only the tyranny but the tyrant, stand forth. Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom has been haunted round the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled her. Europe regards her as a stranger, and England has given her warning to depart. Oh, receive the fugitive and prepare in time an asylum for mankind. What great words. And you can see how this had an effect on people. It's like, yeah, man, I'm with that. I'm down with that. So you can see what effect Tom Paine had on common people. All right, let's go back just a little bit more here. Let me see. We're not going to get through this whole section. We'll go just a couple more paragraphs. He, Paine, thus tapped into widespread public sentiment evidenced by the petitions urging independence that poured into the Continental Congress. Many colonial delegations received instructions from home to support independence by May of 1776. On May 15th, Virginia resolved in its convention to create a Declaration of Rights, a constitution, a federation, and foreign alliances. And in June, it established a Republican government for all intents and purposes, declaring its independence from England. So Virginia basically said, hey, we're independent. Why don't you join us? The newly elected governor was Patrick Henry, who had exclaimed the immortal cry of "Give me liberty or give me death." Virginia led the way, and when the state congressional delegations were sent to vote on independence, only Virginia's instructions were not conditional. The Commonwealth had already thrown down the gauntlet. By the way, there's only, what, 3 Commonwealths in the Union? Virginia, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. In June, Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee, by the way, it was important, they all thought, that a Virginian introduced the resolutions. Because although John Adams in Massachusetts and the Massachusetts delegation at that point had the greatest claim to somebody tyrannizing them, right? That Boston and the Quartering Acts and the Intolerable Acts and all that sort of stuff. They thought it would go better if it came from somebody outside of Massachusetts. And so everybody wanted it to come from Virginia, and it did. So Richard Henry Lee introduced a resolution that these colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The statement so impressed John Adams that he wrote, quote, "This day the Congress has passed the most important resolution ever taken in America." As the momentum forward toward separation with England grew, Congress appointed a committee to draft a statement announcing independence. Members included John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and the chairman, Thomas Jefferson, to whom the privilege of writing the final draft fell. Jefferson wrote so eloquently and succinctly that Adams and Franklin made only a few alterations, including Franklin's self-evident phrase. Most of the changes had to do with adding references to God. Even so, the final document remains a testament to the skill of Jefferson in capturing the essence of American ideals. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," he wrote, "that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." It is worth noting that Jefferson recognized that humans were created by a supreme being, that all rights existed only in that context. Further reiterating Locke, he wrote that, quote, "To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers." Whose just powers? The government's just powers. "From the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government." Government, therefore, according to Jefferson, was natural, not artificial, like Locke said. Because if you get rid of one, you got to put in a new one. Why, Tom? Because it's natural. It's what people do. It's our telos to do government. When one government disappeared, the citizenry needed to establish another. But it should be kept in mind that these, quote, "self-evident rights" constituted, quote, "an escalating sequence of connected assertions that ended in the Revolution, appealing not only to God, but to English history and law." This distanced Jefferson from the writings of Hobbes, and even though he borrowed heavily from Locke, he had further backed away from the notion that the civil state was artificial. On the other hand, Jefferson, by arguing that men, quote, instituted governments, borrowed entirely from the Enlightenment proposition that government was a human creation in the first place. In short, the Declaration clearly illustrated the dual strains of Western thought that had emerged as predominant in the 1700s, a continuing reverence for the primacy of God in human affairs, and yet an increasing attraction to the notion that earthly systems depended on human intellect and action, even when all aspects of that philosophy were not yet embraced. Jefferson's original draft contained, quote, censures on the English people that some in Congress found excessive, and revisions, despite John Adams's frequent defenses of Jefferson's words, excised those sentences. The most offensive was Jefferson's traditional Virginia account of American slavery being the fault of England. But any criticism of slavery, no matter whose fault, also indicted the slave colonies and was not tolerated. After a bitter debate over these phrases and other editing that changed about half of the draft, Congress adopted the final declaration on July 4, 1776, after adopting a somewhat less refined versions on July 2nd. 2 weeks later, and by the way, it's that July 2nd that I think it was Franklin that said, oh, this is going to be the day remembered in history and church bells will ring. He was right, but he was off by 2 days. 2 weeks later, Congress voted to have the statement engrossed on parchment and signed by the members who either appeared in person on August 2nd or afterward affixed their names, Hancock's being the largest, since he reportedly wanted the king to be able to read it without his spectacles. Each one of the 56 signers knew that the act of signing the declaration made them traitors to the crown, and therefore the line in which the delegates, quote, mutually pledged to each other our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor, literally exposed these heroes to execution. When they put their names on there, they basically said, if this goes south, I am a dead man. My family will be put in prison, and there will be no lands left. By the end of the war, almost every one of these 57 signers had lost his property. Many had lost wives and families to British guns or prisons. Several died penniless, having given all to the American Revolution. Maybe if I can find it next time, I'll read Rush Limbaugh's Fathers, the Men Who Risked Everything. It's a great tribute to these 57 heroes. And next time, for sure, we will look at the Declaration of Independence in detail. Meanwhile, email me at larry@wildworldofhistory.com, and I will send you an hour reading of the declaration I did for the Faith and Freedom Foundation, which I fully produced. And I went through the declaration line by line and just took it apart and deconstructed it. So if you want that video, it's free. Just email me at larry@wildworldofhistory.com. All right. We will pick up there next time. Thanks for joining me. Remember, check out the VIP on the Wild World of History. There are ongoing 5 lesson programs, I think, with a total of about 40 videos. Reagan, the American president, the 1620 default, which blows out of the water the 1619 project. Horrible history of Howard Zinn, enduring lessons on life and citizenship. There's, I think, at least one more. There's a free PDF book on cell phones and the damage they're doing to our kids and how you can better monitor and control that. Don't abolish them. I'm not talking about burning your cell phones. Okay. There's 40 Wild Wednesday webcasts in my video archives, all available to VIP members. And there's new stuff coming this week. I'm going to add some more lessons coming this week. So check it out. $6 a week, $69 a year to be a VIP. You won't regret it. And also remember, I am trying to make Patriots history into a John Adams, Sons of Liberty, Chosen type video series. And I need your help. So watch the trailer on wildworldofhistory.com. And if you like the trailer, buy me a coffee. Buy me 5 copies, buy me 100. Whatever you can do to help support the video project. We are getting there. We're inching forward. It's slow, but we are getting there. We're moving forward. So help me out at Wild World of History. Buy Larry a copy. And I'll see you guys back here Wednesday.